Humanist. My name is Todd Kimball. It's an honor to be with you this morning. Happy Father's Day. Many things to celebrate this weekend. We're celebrating or honoring Juneteenth, as well as the big weekend for Pride. So many things to celebrate as we have some sunshine on this Sunday. A reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice.
It's Happy Father's Day, everyone. So the reading is from Fareed Zakaria. I think that's the way you pronounce it. And the title is, Why is America So Polarized? The battle over abortion may be the precursor to even larger struggles between red and blue America. Studies show that the political divide in this country is much wider than that of other countries surveyed. There are many causes, but the primary one is religion. Since 2007, the United States has become secularized with astonishing rapidity. We now rank as the 12th least religious country in the world. But this rapid change has brought about a strong backlash among religious Americans. In a recent study that asked whether religion should play a larger role in their society, 71% of conservatives said yes, but only 29% of liberals agreed. Now, this is a 42-point gap. It's off the charts compared with other countries. This tension has split us into two countries. One is urban, educated, multicultural, secular, and socially liberal, with values that would fit comfortably with Northern European Protestant countries like England and Sweden. The other is rural, religious, traditional, and less educated, with values similar to those in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia. This raises a troubling question. Can these two Americas find a way to live, work, cooperate with, and tolerate one another?
Many times last week, as I was watching the January 6th hearings, I found myself saying, I wonder what Dr. Jeff would say about that. The Humanist Program Committee came through for me once again, as he is here for what I believe is a record for an HGP presenter's 17th time. Dr. Jeff Seward was born in Chicago and grew up in an Air Force family. He crisscrossed the country, attending 6 universities, including MIT, UT Austin, and the University of Washington, before earning his Ph.D. in political science from Stanford. He has taught for 32 years at the University of the Pacific and will be retiring from there this August. I'm sure I speak for many when I say that in a single presentation, Jeff can talk me off the ledge and have me Google, can I become an expat? His presentations are always insightful, entertaining, and thought-provoking. Let's have a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience and a rousing ovation from the Friendly House for Dr. Jeff Seward.
Hello, everybody. Just one minor correction. It's Pacific University. The University of the Pacific is in Stockton, California. A few years ago, the University of the Pacific made the NCAA basketball tournament. And when they showed up for their first game, lo and behold, there was the Pacific University banner up on the wall. They were not amused, but we were. I just wanted to start off by saying I'm not going to do exactly what I advertised in the blurb I sent to describe my talk. I said I was going to go through these 3 organizations that rate democracy, The Economist, Freedom House, and VDEM, and go through their criteria and then give my own take on those criteria. But as I started trying to do that, it became way too complicated. And in the case of VDEM, even very technical. So I decided to ditch that and just give you my assessment of the state of American democracy. But those are very interesting. I encourage you to check them out. If you go check The Economist, Freedom House, and an organization called VDEM, V-DEM, that one in particular has a very elaborate system for evaluating democracies that I think you might find interesting. So for me, American democracy is in critical condition. That's my diagnosis. And Donald Trump is not the only, or maybe even the biggest problem. That's not to say that Trump is not a problem. His insistence on propagating the big lie has convinced a majority of Republicans and perhaps 30% of the public as a whole that the last election was stolen. That has given the Republican Party a green light to work very hard at every level to rig the 2022 and 2024 elections in their favor. That's taking a multitude of forms, trying to limit the ability of various Democratic constituencies to vote, electing state secretaries of state who are willing to interfere in the counting of results, and local organizing to pack voting places with election workers and observers who will challenge and otherwise harass Democratic voters, etc. They have just nominated as their candidate for governor of Pennsylvania, a key swing state, a man who participated in the insurrection on January 6th and participated in efforts to overturn Biden's victory in Pennsylvania, and who promises to make sure that Pennsylvania will certify a Republican as the winner in 2024. The big lie also gives a majority of Republicans the conviction that any election that they lose must have been stolen. And therefore they are justified in using illegal and even violent action against election officials or other institutions that are certifying the results. This coincides with a refusal to denounce the January 6th insurrection and even leads many in the Republican Party to justify it. This big lie is reminiscent of the big lie that Hitler used in the 1920s to mobilize Nazi and other right-wing nationalist militants. The myth of the stab in the back, that Germany was winning World War I until socialists and Jews stabbed the army in the back by defeatist mobilization back home. In some ways, Trump's big lie is even more dangerous than Hitler's big lie, because it not only demonizes the opposition, but it also suggests that the central institution of American democracy, free and fair elections, has been radically corrupted and cannot be trusted. But these consequences of the big lie only accentuate trends that have been underway long before Trump became president. If Trump were to die of a heart attack tomorrow, the big lie would almost certainly live on, and the crisis of American democracy would continue to be profound. Let me go through a series of these pre-Trump trends that are continuing into the present. First, the growing trend towards minority rule. Both structural and political factors have consolidated minority Republican rule of the country, thus violating the central principle of democratic procedure that majorities should control results. Much of this is baked into our Constitution. The Senate, as I'm sure all of you are aware, is profoundly undemocratic. Wyoming, with less than 600,000 people, gets the same 2 senators as California, with just under 40 million people. That ratio is more than 65-1. Of course, this was intentional on the part of the founders. It was a compromise designed to guarantee that the smaller states would not get steamrolled by the larger states. But the ratio between the smallest state and the largest state at the time of the Constitutional Convention was much smaller than it is today. The smallest state was Delaware, with a population of just under 60,000. The largest state was Virginia, with just under 750,000. So the ratio of the biggest state to the smallest state at the time of the Constitutional Convention was only 12.5-1. Today it is 65-1, a disparity 5 times as large. The 16 smallest states have a total population pretty close to equal to California, but they get 32 senators while California gets only 2. These smaller states are predominantly Republican dominated, so they have a big advantage in building a majority in the US Senate, even if they represent a minority of the electorate. A similar, if less egregious advantage is of course built into the Electoral College, which gives each state a number of votes equal to the total of their representatives in the House, plus their 2 senators. So Wyoming, for example, instead of getting 1 electoral vote, gets 3. This Electoral College hasn't mattered much up until recently. The winner of the popular vote nearly always won the Electoral College vote as well, but twice now in this century, in 2000 and 2016, George W. Bush and Donald Trump were both elected with a minority of the popular vote. This reality has also affected the Supreme Court. Democrats have won the popular vote for president in 7 of the last 8 elections, going back 30 years to 1992. Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 elections. The only exception was George Bush's narrow win in 2004. Yet the Supreme Court now has 6 members selected by Republican presidents and only 3 selected by Democrats. Moreover, the Republican minority control of the Senate made it possible to block the Democrats' nomination of Merrick Garland and effectively steal one of the seats. So the radically conservative majority on the Supreme Court is now able to impose minority positions on abortion rights, gay and lesbian rights, gun control, anti-discrimination legislation of all sorts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even when the Democrats manage a majority in the Senate, the filibuster rule that requires a 60-vote majority to pass any major piece of legislation has allowed Republicans to block most major Democratic initiatives, even when the Democrats have a majority. The filibuster used to be invoked only rarely, but Republicans have institutionalized it to become routine as a way to hamstring Democratic majorities. And right now, with only 50 Democratic senators, it only takes 1 Democratic senator like Joe Manchin to prevent a vote to override the filibuster rule for any piece of legislation. This almost guarantees that any Democratic administration will be essentially paralyzed in addressing most major national challenges. That in turn reinforces the conservative Republican narrative that government is unable to solve problems. As for the House of Representatives, it is supposed to reflect the popular vote, but egregious levels of gerrymandering have meant that Republicans consistently get a 5 to 6% overrepresentation in the House as well. This is even more radical at the state level in some places. In Wisconsin, for example, due to gerrymandering by a temporary Republican majority in the legislature, Democrats in a recent election won 55% of the vote for the Wisconsin legislature, but Republicans nevertheless won a veto-proof majority in the legislature and then used that majority that was based on a minority of the vote to strip the Democratic governor of much of his statutory authority. So minority rule is virtually baked into our political processes and has gotten progressively worse over the last 30 years. A second very disturbing trend is the politicization and delegitimation of the electoral process itself. This dates especially from the 2000 presidential election, when Al Gore was denied the presidency by a highly partisan Supreme Court decision after winning the popular vote and probably winning Florida. This transparently partisan outcome was the beginning of a progressively greater politicization of the electoral process itself. Republicans, and to a lesser degree Democrats, realized that manipulating the rules of the game of democratic elections could be as successful as winning votes. So every subsequent election has been accompanied by court challenges and subsequent highly partisan changes in the election rules. When election rules are stable, the myth that the electoral process is essentially a neutral, fair arbiter of the political competition is sustainable. It's never completely true, of course. Electoral rules always favor some political forces over others. But if the rules are stable over time, they are accepted as being essentially fair. If they change in every election cycle as a result of transparently partisan changes of the rules of the game, then electoral rules become simply another forum for political competition. Whichever side loses the election is strongly motivated to interpret their loss as a result of unfair manipulation of the rules instead of their own political failure. If the electoral rules are not accepted as neutral, then there is no reason why the results of elections should be respected. They are just one more political fact among many, and maybe not the decisive fact. One of the great virtues of democratic elections is that they moderate political conflict. Parties and candidates can fight aggressively with each other, but agree to settle the conflict through the outcome of elections. But if the rules of the electoral game are just another part of political conflict, it comes to seem legitimate to use other political resources to contest the partisan electoral outcomes. Any and all forms of direct action suddenly feel legitimate. Riots, strikes, bribery, blackmail, coups, all suddenly seem within bounds. Because all's fair in love and war, and without confidence in elections, politics returns to being just another kind of war with no fixed rules governing the battle. In such a world, it's always nice to win an election. It's worth some propaganda points, but it's never definitive. And law itself becomes less of a limiting factor as well, because undermining the legitimacy of elected representatives also undermines the legitimacy of the laws that they pass and try to enforce. The most extreme form of this return to the jungle is, of course, civil war. I have a friend, a retired professor of US history who just finished teaching a course on the Civil War, who believes we are headed for civil war. And he's worried about it because liberals and progressives don't have many guns and the conservatives are armed to the teeth. I don't agree with him because the two sides are too intermingled geographically. We aren't going to get a region of the country seceding or organized armed forces to march on Washington. But I do think we are headed for a big increase in political violence. January 6th was the most extreme example, but the near riots that are going on at school board meetings, county commissioner meetings, or outside election processing facilities are all going to get more frequent. There is already a long history of violence against abortion clinics and an emerging wave of violence against LGBTQ events. Election officials and elected officials are increasingly subjected to personal harassment and death threats and have to worry about the physical security of themselves and their families. And while this is coming primarily from the right, this isn't only a right-wing phenomenon. The nightly rioting in Portland and other cities, piggybacking on the largely peaceful Black Lives Matter movement, also falls into this category. Some left-wing lunatic was arrested last week for planning to assassinate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. A Catholic organization claims there have been dozens of violent attacks on pro-life pregnancy counseling facilities, and a group called Jane's Revenge has published manifestos threatening to systematically assault pro-life organizations and facilities. The spread of violent direct action on one side inevitably leads to support for violent direct action by the other side. That's what happened in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, as political assassination became a frequent tactic of right-wing extremists, and armed militias formed by both the Nazis and the left, both socialists and communists, brawled and murdered each other in the streets. It's what happened in Argentina in the 1970s, as political violence across the political spectrum led to the imposition of one of the most violent and murderous military regimes in Latin American history. A related phenomenon is the demonization of the political opposition. Being on the left myself, I see this as having started mainly on the right among conservatives. For years, Republicans, long before Trump, Republicans demonized the lamestream media and intermittently labeled Democrats as traitors. To cite just one example, Ann Coulter, the notorious right-wing provocateur, a couple of years ago, published a book titled Treason, Liberal Treachery from the Cold War to the War on Terrorism. The theme was that since the end of World War II, the Democratic Party has been perpetually run by terrorists. Supporters of abortion rights are labeled murderers who are supporting a modern Holocaust. More recently, the QAnon crazies have convinced large segments of the Republican electorate that major Democratic leaders are at the head of a ring of pedophiles who are trafficking in children and child porn. Any sympathetic treatment of LGBTQ issues is now denounced as grooming to prepare children for the Democratic pedophile rings. Liberals have responded to this sort of hysteria and the neo-fascist character of Trump's devoted followers by understandably demonizing right-wing extremists and tending to put all conservatives and Republicans in that category. And to be fair, there's a long tradition of left activists branding even mainstream conservatives as fascist. And this demonization and polarization are getting worse and worse. A growing number of people think it would be terrible if their children were to marry someone from the opposing political party. We are also segregating ourselves residentially into conservative and progressive enclaves. I have a very intelligent older brother that neither I nor my younger brother speak to anymore because he has become a rabid Trumpian and recently has become active in an anti-gay Christian church. If people on the other side are not simply ideological opponents, but the epitome of evil with a capital E, then any tactic is legitimate to keep these monsters from getting political power. It doesn't matter if they get power through free and fair elections. If their power is going to be used to implement evil, they have to be stopped. To quote Malcolm X, by any means necessary. As Barry Goldwater famously said at the 1964 Republican Convention, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. That's a line that's now being embraced on both sides of the political spectrum. This delegitimation of elections and demonization of opponents makes resolving conflict through democratic processes not only less likely, but fundamentally irrational. Democratic processes only make sense within a community that shares a substantial core of common values and is trying to resolve relatively secondary conflicts around the margin. We no longer have, as Fareed Zakaria pointed out in today's reading, we no longer have a national community that shares much of anything in the way of core values. Added to this, I believe, is that people in general have no very strong commitment to the abstract idea of democracy. They value democracy as a way to avoid tyranny, but if the political opposition is seen as a bunch of would-be tyrants, ceding power to them through a democratic process is a betrayal of fundamental values. Democracy is also seen as a moderate way of muddling through by resolving non-existential conflicts through reasonable compromise. But if all conflicts are seen as embodying existential threats, reasonable compromise is nothing more than surrender to evil. People are more committed to substantive results than to reasonable processes. Democracy in the United States has not delivered any major accomplishments since the end of the Cold War, except possibly great advances in LGBTQT rights, and that has deeply divided the country instead of uniting it. Our economy has only limped along. Inequality has grown worse and worse. We handled the pandemic crisis very poorly, and we aren't really facing the crisis of climate change much at all. The political process seems paralyzed, especially for those with a progressive agenda. And those with a conservative agenda feel that government, when it functions at all, has only produced a wave of assaults on their freedom and their traditional way of life. Not surprisingly then, the number of Americans who say they trust that the government will do the right thing most or all of the time has plummeted dramatically. In 1964, 77% of Americans said they trusted that the government would do the right thing. Now only 20% say that. Only 20% of Americans say they trust the government to do the right thing. Another pillar of a democratic society is a free press. In many respects, the US has the freest press of any country in the world. That should count strongly on the side of affirming the health of American democracy. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. A free press is supposed to create an atmosphere in which reasonable public debate from all corners of the political spectrum can arrive at reasonably fact-based conclusions about important public issues, can seek out the truth of major public issues. It contributes to creating substantial real consensus about how to approach major problems. That requires, however, two important things. One, a reasonably professional, ethical, responsible set of journalistic media, and two, an inclination of the public to pay attention to that media. We have an extremely good set of professional media organizations, both print and broadcast. But unfortunately, a large minority, possibly even a substantial majority of the public, no longer pays much attention to the professional media. Side by side with professional journalism, there now exists a vast outpouring of irresponsible, unprofessional, incompetent, and even dishonest media, spewing out all sorts of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and bigotry that is much more influential than the professional mainstream media. There is, of course, Fox News, which has become nothing but a propaganda machine for extreme right politics. There are Russians and other foreign governments intentionally flooding social media channels with divisive nonsense and conspiracy theories that too many people take seriously. There are social media companies that have created algorithms that radicalize careless consumers in all kinds of bizarre directions by channeling them to more and more extreme versions of their initial opinions. So a major scandal like January 6th has an impact only on a left-wing audience that doesn't need to be persuaded. At least I'm worried that that's the case. While much of the population that might be persuaded by professional coverage of the facts is instead immersed in right-wing nonsense that claims the professional media is spouting nothing but partisan lies. So we have a very free press, but its very freedom has spawned a huge network of bullshit that drowns out any common set of facts around which rational debate can revolve. This same reality has undermined respect for all forms of professional expertise. John Stuart Mill in the early 1800s said something about political life that I think is still relevant to contemporary democracy. Mill said, "The grand difficulty in politics will for a long time be how best to conciliate the two grand elements on which good government depends. To combine the greatest amount of advantage derived from the independent judgment of a specially instructed few with the greatest degree of the security for rectitude of purpose derived from rendering those few responsible to the many." Not everything in a democratic society needs to be or ought to be democratic. We don't want medicine to be run by majority vote of the patients. We don't want day-to-day environmental regulation to be determined by popular referendum. We don't want courts to take a public opinion poll before arriving at judicial decisions. We don't want university curricula dictated by state legislatures, et cetera, et cetera. Even the most democratic democracy necessarily relies on the expertise of what Mill called the specially instructed few. Any well-functioning democracy needs to have an informed respect for professional expertise, while at the same time possessing an evidence-based skepticism about the decisions of professional expertise. This is a tricky balance, but absolutely essential for achieving that combination that Mill talks about between deferring to the expertise of technical elites and at the same time holding them democratically accountable. But professional expertise of almost every kind is under tremendous assault from ignorant and irresponsible pseudo-democratic populism. A large part of the public, but especially conservative Republicans, don't trust scientific experts on evolution. In fact, a majority of the population does not believe in evolution. Don't trust scientific experts on climate change or public health. They don't trust academia. They don't trust government officials. They don't trust professional journalists. Expertise in general is seen as controlled by and in the service of partisan political projects hostile to conservatives, hostile to freedom, hostile to Christianity, and hostile to traditional American life. It has often been said that the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy. However, in some important respects, the solution to the problems of our democracy is less democracy, at least less of the sort of democracy that makes policy based on professional expertise impossible, or the sort of democracy that makes the life of responsible public officials a living hell, or the sort of democracy that believes that every irresponsible extremist propagandist like Alex Jones deserves the same level of attention and respect as the New York Times or CBS News. These assorted pathologies of American political life are nurturing the authoritarian temptation on both the right and the left. Besides the attempted Trumpian coup of January 6th, one of the most disturbing manifestations of this authoritarian temptation on the right has been the growing admiration for the authoritarian government of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Orban has risen to power by demonizing immigrants and spreading anti-Semitic rhetoric in the form of assaults on George Soros, who was born in Hungary and has been active in supporting Hungarian educational institutions. Orban has taken an essentially pro-Putin stance on the war in Ukraine. He has completely eliminated the free press by a combination of repression and the purchase of all major media outlets by pro-Orban cronies. He has emasculated the independent judiciary and rigged the electoral laws in a way that give his party a nearly unassailable supermajority in the national parliament. American conservatives are so enamored of Orban's government that CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, one of the leading conservative groups in the Republican Party, actually chose to have its annual convention this year in Budapest so that they could celebrate the Orban government and learn from its practices up close. I myself, on the left, have something of a yearning for some sort of authoritarian progressive government that would be so dominant that it could implement sweeping progressive changes to the Constitution, reform the Senate, abolish the Electoral College, repeal the Second Amendment's protection of the right to bear arms, enact the Equal Rights Amendment, enshrine abortion rights and LGBTQ rights in the Constitution, etc. And then enact a sweeping agenda of progressive legislation to address climate change, racism, poverty, and ignorance. Part of me says that if some aspects of our democratic institutions had to be temporarily trampled or suspended in the process, that would be a small price to pay for a sweeping progressive transformation of American society and institutions. I don't think I'm alone on the left in having part of me be attracted to that authoritarian temptation. Unfortunately, the only viable political force in American life with a strong authoritarian vocation is the Republican Party. And even more unfortunately, the Republican Party seems on the verge of recovering control of Congress in 2022 and very possibly the presidency in 2024, with or without Trump. Our two-party system almost guarantees this. If the Democrats are floundering, the public gravitates to the only alternative without paying much attention to what that opposition looks like. To date, the Republican Party has paid almost no political price for its extremism. Canada has a new Democratic Party that can serve as an outlet for voters disillusioned with the liberal and conservative parties. Germany has the Free Democratic Party in the center and the Green Party for those who want an alternative to Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. Britain has the Liberal Party and some regional parties like the Scottish National Party for those who are tired of the Conservatives and Labour. In the US, if the electorate is tired of the Democrats, their only real alternative is a Republican Party, no matter how authoritarian, bigoted, and corrupt it may be. So what's my diagnosis? I hate to say this, but I think things are likely to become substantially worse before they get better, if in fact they ever get better. As I said, all of the problems I outlined above are trends. I don't think they have exhausted themselves yet. They are likely to continue to get worse. And I don't see any major counter trends that are likely to arrest their development. I think it not at all unlikely that our children will experience the essential end of the American democratic experiment.
Thank you, Jeff, for a compelling presentation and some somber words there, somber conclusion. I know we're all kind of digesting all of that and thinking of our questions. They will be coming in mass shortly, I'm sure. I'll go ahead and start with the first question. I've been saying for a while that I feel like, as you kind of mentioned, the only two options are violence to come to a resolution in this country, or some radical change in democracy, which seems unlikely. But I think the interesting thing right now is that many people in Republican states would want a different country. They would want a country with no abortion, pro-guns, pro-oil, and liberals would want something else. So why don't we, as a country, really start talking about separating between liberal and conservative into multiple countries?
Yeah, on many days, I believe that the Civil War was a mistake, that we should have just let the South secede and work towards uniting the rest of the country with Canada. Eventually, the South would have abolished slavery like Brazil did, probably in another 30 years. And they would have been free to pursue their own bizarre notion of politics by themselves. And the rest of the country would have become pretty similar to social democratic Europe. I'm a big fan of Cascadia. If it were a plausible reality, I'd be perfectly happy with the secession of Oregon, Washington, Northern California, join us up with British Columbia, and create an independent country. I think that would be nice, but these are all pipe dreams too. None of that is going to happen. And so we're forced to live together in the same country, although we are, as I said, residentially segregating ourselves. So you get progressive enclaves like Portland and reactionary enclaves like much of the South. So we can move to local places that are closer to our desires. But I think that it's increasingly the case that people are considering moving abroad. I regaled you with my desire to move to Uruguay a few years ago. My younger brother, who's a sort of a moderate center-left Democrat, a successful lawyer, and an officer in a private business. His wife recently acquired Irish citizenship because she's of Irish descent. And he and his wife are seriously thinking, if things get worse, of moving to Ireland, where they have access to the EU and so forth. I really don't see things getting better. I'd like to make one caveat though. I could be completely wrong. In 1972, I was a delegate to the Democratic Platform Committee. But before the year was out, I had abandoned the Democratic Party and become a candidate for elector for Benjamin Spock on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. And Spock actually visited, this was in Idaho, Spock actually visited Boise and we had a reception for him in my house. And a number of my Democratic friends came and they were saying, what are you doing? You know, you had a promising future in the Democratic Party here. And what is this peace and freedom nonsense? What are you doing? And I remember I very clearly told them, well, you know, fascism is coming to America. Nixon is going to create a fascist America. And so we've got to react. Well, we didn't become a fascist America under Nixon. Instead, we threw him out. In my profession, specialists in Latin America, in the 1970s, all the major Latin American countries were military dictatorships. And the professional consensus was, this was more or less a permanent condition. That there were structural reasons, cultural reasons, political, economic reasons for the authoritarianism in Latin America, and it was never going to change. It might even get worse. Well, within 10 years, all of those military dictatorships had made transitions to democracy, and those democracies have all pretty much survived, or they've limped along. They're not all in great shape, but they've survived now for 40 years. So politics can turn around pretty fast sometimes, and political realities that seem permanent can become distant memories. But I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to turn around the trends that I've described.
And let's go to Al from our Zoom community.
Jeff, you talked about violence, increasing violence in politics, et cetera. My thoughts are that perhaps we have it wrong, that it's not the ability to put people in the street who are willing to be violent that matters as far as producing change. It's the willingness of people in the streets who are willing to have their heads busted without being violent. And maybe that there's just not enough of us who are willing to go out in the streets and get our heads, get ourselves hit on the head. I'm not certainly in the category looking for getting hit with a brick or something, but maybe there's some lack of courage, and that if we can convince people that there's a form of nonviolence that still produces the rewards of actually changing things, and that it might involve personal risk, that maybe we can get people motivated that way.
Well, one thing that strikes me is that there's kind of an exhaustion of the inclination to mount large protest demonstrations. I was reading a column the other day by a feminist author who was bemoaning the fact that there's been so little response from the feminist movement about the impending abortion decision. There have been demonstrations around the country, but they've drawn like 5,000 people compared to the huge women's march that happened immediately following Trump's election, for example. I think people are tired of doing street demonstrations that don't change anything. And it makes them even less willing to get beat on the head for them. So social movements have sort of exhausted themselves in that they haven't developed any new tactics that really produce change, and they aren't even able to mount the sort of mass action that they used to. So I don't see a lot of hope there. The other thing is that movements like the civil rights movement, especially, but also the gay rights movement and the women's movement, depended for their effectiveness, when they did get their heads bashed in, on that arousing the conscience of people across the country to sympathize with their obviously just demands to end segregation. But I'm not sure that conscience is there in a majority of the population to support gay and lesbian rights, for example, or transgender rights. And increasingly, one of the things that's really worrisome to Democrats is those traditional cultural issues are beginning to make inroads in the Hispanic vote electorate and in the Black electorate. And if the proportion of Democratic vote in the Hispanic community goes from 70% to 55%, and in the Black community from 92% to 75%, Democrats won't win another election in our lifetimes. And so it's not clear that the conscience of the country is on the side of very much of the progressive agenda.
I have a question from Ingrid, right up your alley here, Jeff. Secondary to our extreme polarization in the US, what changes have you seen at our universities?
I don't know. You know, I read about all the terrible things that are happening in universities, all the divisions and polarizations and so forth. I guess Pacific University is too insular a place. I didn't really experience that at Pacific University, except in the most minor, trivial ways. I think the notion that there's this rampage of progressives terrorizing faculty members in universities across the country is substantially exaggerated. It does exist, but I don't think it's a major trend. More worrisome to me is the efforts of state legislatures to try to start running universities directly and saying, well, we don't need an English department. We don't need an English major or a sociology major or an art history major or an anthropology major or a political science major or a history major. There are universities, major public universities, like one campus in the University of Wisconsin system, that are eliminating these majors because the legislature, and Spanish even, they were eliminating because the legislature doesn't think that they help people get jobs. And so there's this push among conservatives across the country to say, hey, the legislature is paying for the universities, although the legislatures are not paying near as big a share of university expenses as they used to. And therefore, we have the right to tell them what to teach. And we have the right to impose loyalty tests on them. And we have a right to make them show us their syllabi so we can see whether they're teaching things about race or gay rights that we think are bad. Well, universities can't exist if there's outside interference like that in a significant way. Private universities are a little more insulated from that, but public universities are very vulnerable.
Joyce types a question in the chat. Are attempts at bipartisan conversations that are almost always pulling progressives a waste of time? Is there a better alternative?
I think they're probably useful for people that are close to you, just so that maybe you can get to a point of mutual tolerance and restore fundamental civility among your family and friends. I think as a broad national solution, I don't think they have much impact. That kind of conversation is apparently completely broken down at the level of the Congress. You know, Republicans, Democrats don't talk to each other at all. They don't have lunch together. They demonize each other at that level. And when I say demonization is a problem, I don't mean to suggest that there are no demons. There are people out there in political life who deserve to be demonized and need to be marginalized, and they're not being marginalized. Instead of being marginalized, they're becoming more and more prominent within the Republican Party. When I was growing up, the John Birch Society was every bit as nutty as the extreme right is today. But they didn't have Fox News, and they didn't have social media, and they didn't have support from the mainstream of the Republican Party. They were sort of marginalized. They kind of became part of Barry Goldwater's campaign, and there's a whole thing about William F. Buckley having marginalized the John Birch Society, but he didn't actually. He only condemned their leader. He welcomed the membership into the Republican Party. But extremists like this were marginalized because they were relatively small groups and they had a hard time speaking to each other or getting together. Social media and right-wing national media like Fox News has made it possible for right-wing nuts to get together and to mobilize and to organize all this thing that they organized to attack this LGBTQ Pride Week up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, is incredible. And it's happening all over the country that Proud Boy type people are organizing to harass and disrupt Pride events and even use physical violence against them. Well, it's hard to have a dialogue there. I don't know how you have dialogue with the Proud Boys. Now, occasionally you get deprogramming. These things are cult-like. And occasionally somebody managed to escape and become a more reasonable person. And then they come out and talk about how they don't know how they ever got involved with this group and how hard it was to get out and how dangerous they are. But it's sort of an individual here, an individual there. And groups like that are beginning to form on the left as well, who are willing to use violence to attack people that they think should be beyond the pale.
I think we're ready to go to the friendly house once again. A question from David DiNucci.
In the last couple of weeks, I've been seeing a lot of presentations by Jonathan Haidt, who wrote an article in The Atlantic apparently recently. And it has a lot to do with social media and its role in dividing us up into, you know, factions, and how mostly it's based on this idea that social media seems to reward us for being against something or speaking up and just trying to create a big problem in order to get our voice heard. And his proposed solution is not to, you know, go to any great extremes. The main extreme is to give us an identity, and it doesn't even have to be our true identity, but just an identity, so that you can look at the history of people's remarks over time, you know, without even necessarily knowing who the person is. You can see that the person who made this remark has made these other remarks in the past. And just by seeing that, you can get a feel for, you know, whether they're a pure troublemaker or whether they are actually speaking from some like center of a reason. Anyway, do you have any comments on like social media and its role in this thing?
Well, I think that that particular idea would be great for academics and for journalists because it would be a wonderful tool for doing research on the dynamics of social media. But I don't think that people who think QAnon is cool are going to start doing detailed research on the people that they read and tracking their remarks and discovering that they're extremists. They aren't that sort of consumer. And in fact, I don't think most people who spend any time on social media have time to dig into things in that way to sort of monitor who they're following, who they're paying attention to. Instead, they pay attention to the people who sound most reasonable to them. And one of the terrible things is that these social media companies have algorithms that take your original position and feed you into somewhat more radical versions of that you like even better because now they're energetic and militant. And then that feeds you into what? And pretty soon you're consuming a Proud Boy site or some similar kind of a thing. I don't know what reform you can do to fix that. I don't know that you can make such algorithms illegal. Trying to have legislatures micromanage the way social media companies operate seems to me like a fool's errand. So I don't know how you get that toothpaste back in the tube. And it's also, of course, contaminated by completely dishonest actors like the Russians, who do their best to feed conspiracy theories and to aggravate bigotry of all kinds so that we become more divided and less efficacious. I think we're doing a little better job of identifying Russian bots and so forth and excluding them, but only in a marginal way. So the kind of solutions that would make a difference would be like to abolish social media. Well, I don't know how you do that. Right. There's no political will to do that. It would be grossly unconstitutional. And there are lots of nice and wonderful things about social media that people wouldn't want to give up. I don't use any of it. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. Email is as far as I go in terms of social media. But, and I think that gives me a more tranquil life. But that's what people are consuming.
Yeah.
Let's go back to our Zoom community for a live question from Ringa.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a wishful thinking. Maybe it's hopeless. We all know that the rapid disintegration of the Soviet bloc, as well as the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union, happened. Is there any hope such a thing can happen here?
Well, one hope is that authoritarian systems tend to fall apart eventually. They destroy themselves because one of the things they do is they radically interfere with feedback loops for the leadership of authoritarian systems. So they don't know what's going on in their own country because everybody lies to them, and or dissenting voices are completely silenced. And so they develop all kinds of strange delusions. And eventually, because they've so lost touch with where popular sentiment is, the thing falls apart. My favorite theory about the Iraq war against Saddam Hussein is that he actually believed he did have a major weapons of mass destruction operation, because people kept telling him, oh yeah, we're doing this research and it's really promising, and we're going to have biological or chemical weapons or a proto-nuclear thing anytime now. And so he didn't want people inspecting because he thought he had this stuff. I don't know that that's true, but I as a metaphor, I think it's interesting. So he may have self-destructed because of his own delusions. I think Putin is setting himself up for that, because Putin has just shut down the ability of ordinary Russians to communicate what's going on. I don't think he knows what's going on in the battlefront in the Ukraine because all his military people are lying to him. So there is that sort of hope that authoritarianism eventually destroys itself. And the alternative tends to be a restoration of some sort of democracy. What's more difficult is this new, I gave a lecture to all of you 4 or 5 lectures back about, is the United States becoming a competitive authoritarian system where a lot of the facade of democracy is retained. There are still elections in Hungary. You can still stand up on a street corner and give rabid speeches against the government without going to jail. You just can't compete effectively for power. So if you retain the facade of democratic processes, but you gut them of consequential meaning, I think tyrants have learned that maintaining the facade of democratic processes extends their life considerably. And if you do it right, you can also give opposition voices a sort of a more or less guaranteed minority in the national parliament where they can spout off without their spouting off having any effect, but at least you learn what's going on in the minds of opponents. Singapore has a system more or less like this, where the ruling party is essentially an authoritarian party, but they have elections. The opposition wins seats in the national parliament. They can spout off and criticize the government and point out corruption or mistakes. They have a somewhat free press, as long as you don't get too insulting of the leadership, at which time they'll go and bankrupt you through lawsuits. But they have enough freedom that the leadership, the authoritarian leadership, gets a substantial amount of real feedback about what's going on in the society. Unfortunately, I think that's the sort of authoritarianism that the United States would get, if we get it, would be one in which there's the pretense that the Constitution is still in force, that democratic processes are still in force, but the system is so rigged that only right-wing authoritarians ever have power.
Let's stay in our Zoom community for a question from Lawrence.
Okay, Jeff, I'd like to know what you think about how we're thinking about racism these days, especially in the wake of what came out about 2 years ago, the 1619 Project, which encourages us to rethink what America is all about, and that it really all started back in 1619 rather than 1776. And it seems to me that it's encouraging us to rethink what racism is really, and to, frankly, as I see it, to downplay the progress that has been made in combating racism over the last, say, 5 or 6 decades, the decades that I've been alive in. The activism of Martin Luther King and certain advances that have been made to make racism much less a part of our way of life than it was back in the old days. So the question really is, what do you make of the 1619 Project? Do you find that useful? Or
I have mixed feelings about it. I think the idea of it is excellent. And trying to teach us all that racism has been at the core of American political and cultural life since the beginning is really useful. But the specific 1619 Project that was done by a skilled journalist also has some really bad history in it, such as the claim that the American Revolution was primarily an effort to preserve slavery. I think that's nonsense. And there's a lot that you can say about racism and the inadequate way slavery was dealt with as an issue during the revolution. But to say that the revolution was fought primarily in order to preserve slavery, I think is just nonsense. And professional historians who are on the left have criticized that. And there are other places in the 1619 Project where, you know, she went overboard in this way and that way, that tends to discredit the whole project. And I'd say 90% of this project is absolutely on target and really useful. but those few sort of egregious mistakes have made it possible for people to demonize the whole project. And so wherever it's gotten introduced in schools, it's become this flashpoint for major controversy and crowds, descending on school board meetings and demanding people's heads. As for your other comment, I think one of the things that critical race theory and the 1619 Project do is help us understand how much work there still was to do after the great civil rights pieces of legislation. And have tried to emphasize the way that racism is so deeply embedded in American society and culture that it's very hard for anyone to grow up in American society and completely avoid the influence of racist beliefs and attitudes. When I've taught racism stuff in my own classrooms in a freshman seminar, for example, a few years ago, one of the things I tried to emphasize is you can be a good person and still be full of racist stereotypes and racist ideas that you're barely even aware of. And then I would confess to the class racist ideas and stereotypes that I've discovered within myself. And I don't think that makes me a bad person. What makes me a bad person is to try to hang on to them, to try not to uncover them, to try not to set them aside and overcome them. And that seemed to be persuasive to students. What they don't like is people saying, well, you're racist, which means you're an evil, nasty, horrible person. Then that makes them resistant to any realization that they have embodied in themselves racist tropes that they're only barely aware of. So I think it would be a really good idea if schools and other institutions help people see the racism that they've imbibed almost by osmosis in themselves so that they can address it without them feeling like they've been labeled as evil monsters. Because if they feel like they've been labeled evil monsters, then they'll just fight back. And that's what's been happening. And these laws, my favorite law on this is the Florida law that said it will be illegal to teach anything about race in the public schools that makes anybody feel uncomfortable because of their race. Well, if you teach white students about the history of racism in America in a way that it doesn't make them uncomfortable, what the hell are you teaching? Americans should feel uncomfortable about the history of racism in America. That's just preposterous. And so you're now getting a situation in public schools across the country, and not just in the South, where teachers are afraid to teach anything about racism or segregation because it's going to be labeled critical race theory. And without people knowing what the hell critical race theory is about, then that creates a march on the school building. I wouldn't want to be a public school teacher for anything today. There are so many landmines of things you're not allowed to talk about in any reasonably responsible way without all hell breaking loose over your head. And to some extent, this is happening at the university level. Our dean said recently at Pacific that a prospective parent of a prospective student had called her up and said, we're considering coming to Pacific University, but we want to know, is anybody there teaching critical race theory?
We stay in the Zoom community for a question from Kathy Moyd.
Okay, I have kind of a multi-part one that kind of based on some of the other trends that have been occurring over the periods. It used to be that, when I was active in politics in the 70s and 80s, Republicans were supporting businesses, Democrats supported labor. With the changes in decrease in importance of labor and increase of money from corporate interests in the political and lobbying process, that seems to have changed. it also used to be that incumbents didn't get primaried. If you were, once you were an incumbent, you were pretty well guaranteed that you would get through your party's primary and only have to worry about the general election. And clearly that's gradually not becoming true. Citizens United with all the independent expenditures has probably enhanced that. But you know, it turns out the fear of being primary is real. Look at the number of Trumpian candidates defeating incumbent legislators in these elections. So those are a few other trends that I think have made us less democratic.
Gerrymandering has aggravated this primary
agree.
game, because
Agree.
when you gerrymander, one of the things that you do is you create safe districts for your own party, and you pack all the people in the opposing party into a couple of districts where they have an overwhelming majority so that their vote doesn't affect other places. Well, if you have a safe district, the general election is meaningless. And so the primary is the only place where political opposition can occur. It's like the South used to be when it was a one-party system under the Democratic Party. Republicans didn't even bother to run in the South in the first half of the 20th century, the last half of the 19th century. And so whatever political controversy there was within the Democratic primary. Why was JFK visiting Dallas in 1963? Because election was coming up and the Democratic Party in Texas was divided between the liberal Democrat, Ralph Yarborough, and the conservative Democrat, John Connally, who eventually became a Republican. He was going down to try and bring these two factions together so that the Democratic Party in Texas would be united and vote for him in president in 1964. The Republican Party was insignificant at that point. Now it dominates Texas. But so if you're in a district where the only meaningful election can be a primary election, then primary become a threat. And the threat is almost always that you'll be primaried by someone who is more extreme than you are. And so this pushes people out to the extremes in both parties.
Yeah, also the fact that in primaries, the turnout tends to be more from the extremes than from the center.
Yes, very low and more rabid people. Yeah. And so you get this, and it happens on both sides. Being a progressive Democrat myself, I'm happy to see progressives defeat moderate Democratic incumbents in safe districts. I'm not so thrilled to see progressives defeat moderate Democrats in swing districts, because that may mean that instead of a moderate Democrat, you get a Republican.
Yeah, that's the concern in here with Schrader being defeated by a progressive. He's been in pretty much a swing district his whole time, and
it's maybe a more conservative district now with the redistricting. And I hope the progressive Democrat wins, but I worry that she won't. And I would much rather have Schrader than some Eastern Oregon conservative Republican.
At least Bend apparently is going more liberal.
Democratic. So the idea, and I think this is true for Republicans too, is elect the most progressive, or on their side, the most conservative candidate who can get elected.
Let's go back to our live audience at the Friendly House and a question from Roy.
Isn't there anyone who thinks I was too pessimistic and wants to defend the bright prospects of the future of American democracy?
I think it says a lot that there's no one who thinks that.
At the risk of overgeneralizing, I would like to, I kind of see overpopulation coupled with environmental, destruction as a generating force for a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. I don't know if if I'm way off base or not.
Well, I think environmental catastrophes of various sorts fuel political instability, fuel political extremism. I'm really worried about what's going to happen on the African continent in the next couple of years when there's going to be a horrific food crisis because of the war in Ukraine. The wheat and other grains that flow from Russia and the Ukraine just aren't going to flow. And Africa is severely dependent on that food. And lack of food just causes tremendous instability. And so you have some very promising emergent African democracies that I think are going to be put under tremendous strain if there's a food crisis there. And I mean, the same thing happens everywhere. What's really remarkable is, I mean, we still have climate change deniers as we just get wave after wave after wave of the most extreme, bizarre weather events. And this horrible drought that's happening in the American West. And yet, you know, the Republican Party and its supporters don't budge an inch. It's all a hoax. Climate change isn't real. The only thing you can do about it is drill for more oil so that we don't have an energy crisis. It's extraordinary to me how little impact reality has on right-wing extremism. And nothing seems to shatter that thing. I just saw an article today about Herschel Walker, that highly qualified former Heisman Trophy winner running for the Senate in Georgia, who can't put together two coherent sentences about any issue at all. I mean, he's a complete ignoramus. He's completely unprepared to be a political figure. And there's just one scandal after another that gets revealed about him day after day of bizarre lies he's told about his past, about failed business enterprises. He's been running on family values, and now comes out that he's got 3 children that he has basically neglected by different women. So he just showed up at the Faith and Freedom Convention, which is the foremost Christian activist conservative organization, and got a standing ovation. So child neglect and lying and grotesque ignorance, you know, don't matter anymore. That Christians would line up solidly behind someone like Donald Trump shows that Christianity is not what is fundamentally driving the political positions of Christians.
Let's take our final question in this segment from the Zoom community, and Helen Ost.
I'd like to ask something about the critical race theory. I like the idea of it, but the method that seems to be used right now, I'm finding difficult. There's been so much progress, and the way it's being taught seems to emphasize how bad it was rather than the progress that there is. And in teaching, when you're trying to get change, I'm a math person. If I'm going to deal with a student who's got problems with math, I'm not going to tell them about the F's they got before and how uncomfortable they felt before. I'm going to emphasize the positive aspects. And I just had the experience of taking a Red Cross class, a Sierra Club class, where they emphasized the bad parts of the eugenics and the men who started the Sierra Club, and it didn't help me have a good attitude toward the Sierra Club.
Yeah, I think the rationale that I agree with for highlighting the horrors of the American past is that it helps us understand that it's implausible to imagine that what progress we've made in the last 50 years has somehow transcended American racism. The attitude of too many Americans is that the problems of racism are all behind us. There's a poll that people have done for years, sort of saying, who is experiencing more racial discrimination in America? And it used to be that blacks would say blacks were experiencing more racial discrimination, and whites would say, well, yeah, blacks face more discrimination than white people. That's not true anymore. Now a majority of white people say that whites face more racial discrimination than black people do. There's this sense that not only has racism been fixed, but what our current reality is that it's white people who are suffering from racism. And I think educators need to do something to jolt people out of that nonsense and to help people recognize that racism, for all the progress that we've made, still exists and is still doing tremendous harm in the lives of Black people who are facing discrimination in housing and discrimination in employment and discrimination in access to credit. And I think there are good ways and bad ways to do that. And I think often not very thoughtful or very effective ways are being done. I've been subjected at Pacific University to efforts by the diversity team there to sensitize us to racial issues and so forth. And they were embarrassing. They were so intellectually insulting that they were counterproductive. You know, people sort of said, you know, how can you be so insulting as to tell a Ph.D. in sociology that he ought to be aware, you know, that racism sometimes still exists? Duh. You know, he or she has been teaching that in tremendous depth for 20 years. And so there's like a whole industry of people going around and doing diversity training. And I think a great deal of it ends up antagonizing and insulting the intended recipients of it instead of illuminating them. And I don't know that I have a better curriculum for that. I think it's really hard to get people to recognize their own racist impulses if they are strongly committed to the idea that they don't have any. I mean, Donald Trump is typical in that he keeps insisting when anybody raises these issues that he's the least racist person you've ever known. Well, this is obvious nonsense. I mean, he's completely resistant to any suggestion that he harbors any racist feelings whatsoever. I think that's the state for many people, and trying to get past that resistance through a 2-hour educational program at the workplace, I think is extremely difficult. And I don't know the most effective way to do it.